Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Firstly, I'm really, really grateful to Hafid, Afzal, Mushtaq and the brothers who are running this for asking me just to share some of the knowledge that Allah has given me with this to you. So hopefully it's of benefit. The second thing is I get really nervous talking in front of ulama because I'm not an alim. So if I say something that I shouldn't have said, then honestly you just put your hand up and say you shouldn't say that. That would be much better than me saying something that I shouldn't say. So what we're going to talk about over the next 30-40 minutes is what, why, and what to do. What is addiction? Why does it happen, or how does it happen, and what to do about it. Hands up. Who has an addiction? Those that didn't put your hand up, I don't believe you. Yeah, we all do. Okay. En route here, I said to Hafiz Afzal, I told you to get some garak chai ready for me, but don't worry, I'm going to do a detour and get a Tim Hortons. So what happens when you have an addiction? You do things like what I do. Even though there's no need for me to go to Tim Hortons and there's chai walas here, I decided to do a really big detour to get some Tim Hortons to come here because it's just an addiction, right? We all have it. So it's normal. The reason why I'm giving this as an example is that the human mind, it's normal to fall into an addiction. And what's really important when we look at addiction is to do it in a very non-forensic, non-judgmental way, if that makes sense. So what is an addiction? So it's actually classed as a mental disorder. It comes under mental health in terms of the brackets of an illness. That it's characterized by a compulsive consumption or a compulsive behavior. So two things. Either consuming something, smoking, ingestion and so forth, or injecting, or a certain type of behavior. So behaviors can be an addictive type, like masturbation, for example, is a classic example, right? Despite the negative consequences. So despite knowing the negative consequences, there's a compulsive act or behavior. And the more often the person turns towards this pleasurable event, then the cycle precipitates and it just carries on. And that's that's defined as an addiction. But the fine line is that it goes from being pleasurable to then I need it to feel normal. Does that make sense? It goes from being something of pleasure to something I need this, otherwise I don't feel normal. So that's like the fine line. And there's loads of different types of addiction. So the common ones that we know of are alcohol, drugs, but in 2023 there's loads. There's gambling, there's phones, which we should talk about, and everybody's addicted to their phone. 97% of children, they'll say I'm addicted to my phone. 74% of adults say I'm addicted to my phone. Anybody know what's the litmus test to see if you all, what's the litmus test to see if you're addicted to your phone? Any ideas? Maulana? That's the litmus test. When you wake up in the morning and the first thing you do is you engage with your phone and you don't engage with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the du'as of the morning is not just Alhamdulillah alladhi ahyana ba'da ma amatana wa ilayhi nushur. There's pages. And if you're not engaging with God first thing in the morning and you're engaging with your phone, you have an addiction. And the second litmus test is when you're in salah, just see how long your attention span lasts. And people who are addicted to their phones, they don't have an attention span of more than 8 seconds. How many seconds? 8 seconds, less than a goldfish. So when the moment you say Allahu Akbar, if you don't last 8 seconds and your mind has gone off on one, you could well have an addiction to phones. Then there's eating. So one of the things that I'm looking at in work, if you're interested, if you want to get your health right, there's 5 things in your life that you need to get your health right. Number 1, you have to have a super rich, nutritious diet. You have to be physically active. You have to give up substance abuse or anything that's detrimental to your health, that's addictive in nature. You have to get your sleep right, and you have to get your mental health right. There's 5 things that you need in your life, okay? Now, one of the things that I'm looking at right at the top is diet. There's a lot of people who are addicted to foods. So there's a term called food addiction. People are addicted, so if there's children here, I'm sorry, we're just going to have ultra-adult conversations. People are addicted to having sex. People are, and by extension, pornography, by extension, masturbation and so forth. These are all real things that people get addicted to. And don't we see this a lot in the masjids? And if I was an alim, it would drive me insane. If I was the khatib, it would drive me absolutely insane if I saw somebody on their phone in the middle of a khutbah. When you go to a place of worship, hands up, who's been to a church? Put your hands up if you've been to a church. Who's been to a synagogue? Who's been to a Buddhist temple? Who's been to a Sikh place of worship? These guys recognize that the moment you step into the door, you're in a sacred space. And they don't go on their phones. Because they recognize that this is a sacred space where I switch off from the world. But we can't. So this is a big problem. Did you know 57% of adults take their phone into the toilet? Well, what do you do with your phone in the toilet? So one brother, we were talking about this, he said, I've got a really good connection between my phone and my bowels. If I'm not on my phone, I can't evacuate. Right? But it's a real problem, okay? So these things, it's really worth talking about. And I'll marry all this up so you know where I'm going with this. What are the contributing factors? So you've got to remember that it's no one, yes or no or no. Does anybody choose to be an addict? Anybody like this has to be interactive, okay? I don't like just it being one way, okay? Does anybody choose to be an addict? No or no? They don't, right? Nobody wakes up in the morning and goes, hey, I'm just going to smoke some weed today, right? It just doesn't happen, right? I held it as if I smoked. I've never smoked weed, okay? I've never done it. Don't think I have, right? But what are the contributing factors? So there's lots. There's lots, and you can read it on the slide, read it here. No particular order, genetics, so that they've modeled the entire DNA sequence. If you have a family member with a certain medical condition, there's a maximum of 5% chance of you developing that at the same time. So it's not the be-all and end-all, but it does contribute. School, of course it does. You know, if you're around people who FOMO, you know, you can lead into things very, very easily, or influence because you're on the religion of your friend. That's a massive problem. One of the biggest causes is actual mental health causes, which I'm going to dissect as we go along. Stress, one of the biggest causes, okay? And I'll dissect this as we go along as well. Trauma, probably the biggest cause. So remember this. For the ulama, if you're interested in getting involved with working with people, and if you're here because you're struggling, or you know somebody who's struggling, trauma is a big one. And I'll break this down as we go along. Unfortunately, home situation is a big one, like a huge one. I don't know if it's true. I have a friend who's a mufti who deals with marriage problems all the time, and he said, is this true? 1/3 of Muslim marriages are now going to divorce. Is that right? Does that sound about right? 1/3? Yeah, that sounds about right, unfortunately. Okay, if you're a parent here, or if you're thinking of being a parent, you have to make it work for the sake of your children. There is nothing more traumatic for a child than two things. Number one, if the home isn't a home. I'll say it again, if the home isn't a home is supposed to be a safe space of unconditional love. Unconditional love. Not conditional love, I only love you if you do this, that and the other. Unconditional love, safe space. If it's not because both parents are at each other's throats, if it's not because there's one hitting the other, if it's not because one's verbally abusive to another, or there's separation, that is one of the most traumatic things a child goes through. They cannot understand for the life of them why two people who's supposed to be in love are at each other's throats. So they can't tolerate it. And equally, if the parent is abusive towards the child, like, these are my own opinions. Like I said, I'm not an alim. You can correct me if you want. Regardless of the hukam, I don't think a child should be hit. Ever. I've never struck my child. Inshallah, I hope I never have to. ما ضرب بكفه صلى الله عليه وسلم امرأة ولا خادما ولا ولدا. He never struck a woman, someone who served him, or a child. Never. Whatever the hukam is, you know, it's mubah, whatever. It's so traumatic for a child to be slapped. Okay, these things, they're really traumatic for a child. The second thing that's traumatic for a child is not fitting in with their peers. They go to school and they're the odd one out. They go to school, they have no friends. They go to school, they're not in the group. Really, really traumatic. And then you've got community. You know, if you're living in an area, unfortunately, where there's lots of this going around, it's really hard to not step into it. Now remember, 40% of the Muslim population are in poverty. in the lowest social economic bracket. And with poverty comes these sort of things. And so these are the contributing factors. And then there's personality as well. Like if someone just has that, you all know that kid who just wants to, who just wants to try this. We all know that kid, don't we? It's that everything in their life is good, but they're just very, very impulsive. They just want to try it out. They just want to have a thrill. That's the personality type, which you can't do anything about. So these are the general contributing factors of why someone goes into an addictive type behavior. You'll see where I'm going with this in a second. Just follow me. Because for a lot of people, life is like that. They are really struggling to get through life to navigate through life in a very normal, coordinated way. Because there's just so much going on in people's lives, it's really hard to just stay on the straight and narrow. And you've got millions, if not billions, of people on the planet who live like this. Right now, there's 1 billion people who are experiencing some form of mental health problem. So this is what we're dealing with. Now, I mentioned earlier the biggest factor for someone stumbling into an addictive type behavior is trauma. Okay? I want you to remember that. There's not enough time to go through this, but do look into trauma. Like if you're an alim and you work with children or you're a teacher and so forth, do your own research on trauma, what it is and how it affects the human mind. Because there's a lot of it around here, a lot of it. I'll give you an example. When I was in university, in medical school, there was a brother, and this is my fault and our friend's fault. He used to hang around with just anybody. So we were like, well, okay, just leave him alone. And then in third year medical school, when we start doing our clinical work, his friends group changed and he started hanging around with us. And I was in the library with some of my friends, and then we just got up for Dhuhr. And he said, where are you going? I said, we're going to go pray Dhuhr. He said, there's a masjid in the university. I said, yeah. He said, why didn't nobody tell me? And this is one of my biggest regrets in my whole life, that I didn't bother go to him and say, hey, are you Muslim? Hey, did you know there's a prayer room here? You see that? Now, being excluded from somebody because of the way you look or the way other people perceive you, you might think this is small. It's really traumatic for that brother. And the biggest reason why he didn't go to the masjid off his own back was because the moment he walked in, a wave of memories came back to him and said, this is where I got beat. This is where I got what? This is where I got battered. My first teacher of Quran, alayhi rahmah, we respect our teachers that taught us alif bata, but we laugh about it. He was a wonderful man. But when we were in trouble, he used to have this stick with nuts and bolts tied to the end. And he was a good guy, mashallah. He taught really well, but he was an expert at hitting. And he never used to have to get up from his seat. He used to have this stick, and the room was square, and he just put it up in the air and just let it drop like that. But these things are really traumatic for people who have been through these things, so never underestimate it. And like I mentioned earlier, remember, little statistic, 70% of mental health problems actually stem from childhood. That's a huge number. Huge. 70% of mental health problems stem from childhood. Like I said, the biggest factor is trauma. And the biggest cause of trauma is nonsense that goes on in the house. So abuse can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be sexual. Seeing this a lot. I remember once, there's a brilliant psychologist in Manchester called Dr Kate Helene. And I started seeing a pattern where adults would come in and they can't cope with life. And so, I did my own research on trauma and stuff like that. So I started asking about sexual abuse. To just have a wild guess, how many percentage-wise, when I used to ask, have you been sexually abused, how many percentage-wise would say yes? 100. So I called Kate. I said, Kate, look, I'm getting this repeated pattern. Should I ask this in every single patient? She said, absolutely yes, especially men. I was like, especially men. So you've got to understand that some people have been through some serious, capital S in their life, right? Serious poo that they've had to go through. And these things aren't small, okay? These things aren't small. So when you look at somebody's behavior, what's important is to look beyond the behavior and look into their eyes. Guarantee you'll see pain. Then you have people who have experienced neglect. So during COVID, when I was doing the vaccines, We did it in a church. And I was put in one of the pastor's room, and he had this bookshelf, and I was getting bored, so I started reading a book, and it was written by a psychologist about why do men have promiscuous behaviour? Why is it that a man who's happily married to a beautiful woman, why does he go and play away? And he saw the same pattern over and over and over again in nearly every single man, that they didn't feel loved by their father. Not their mother, by their father. And so when he interviewed all these men who were, some of them very highly educated, very rich, professional individuals, so he looked at all echelons of society, and they all had the same pattern. They all complained that when I was a kid, I didn't feel loved by my father. And so what this psychologist concluded is that what men do, they try and, even though they've got a loving, beautiful wife that's devoted to him, he still goes and has an affair and sleeps around with X, Y, and Z, because he's trying to fill a gap that he doesn't realize will not be filled by any woman. And he hasn't made that link that I didn't feel loved by my father. So neglect is a really, really important thing. So any men here, do tell your boys, especially your boys, do tell your boys that you love them. That you love them. Even if they say, I say to my son often, I say, you know, I love you. He goes, shut up, Dad, don't do that, man, come on. Not here, not now. Like, he just doesn't like you, but that's not the point. He can't tolerate that emotion because he's at that age now, but you've got to tell your kid, especially he's a boy, no matter what age he is, you know what, I love you, and no matter what, I love you. Do you remember at the beginning when I said unconditional? Ridiculously important. There's nothing wrong with kissing your son on his head, on his hand. There's nothing wrong with giving him a hug for no reason. Men need that. Men, I'll say it again, men, they need hugs just as much as a woman. There are times where there's patients who are losing it, who are men. You give them a bear hug, oh, they love it, because that's all they wanted, because they never got it. So neglect is a really important thing. Then you've got household dysfunction. If you're living with a parent who has a mental health problem, really difficult for a child to deal with. Really, really difficult to deal with, especially if the mother's treated violently. Okay? Just these things, Mushtaq and Afzal, these things are things that need to be talked about, like separate workshops, because let's be real, this isn't a Muslim problem, this is a global problem. People don't know how to parent anymore. There's a book called Collapse of Parenting. Really recommend you read it. People don't know how to parent anymore. So essentially, the reason why I give you all this spiel is that in a nutshell, what happens is it's an attempt, so this is the next page, it's an attempt to break away from pain, okay? People experience really, really difficult lives. They go through hell and back. So it's a way of breaking away from the pain. Does that make sense? Yeah? It's escapism, right? So what happens is, next page, if this stops working, what should happen is that when you if I was to experience something difficult, okay, how is it going to make me feel? Let's just say, inshallah it won't happen, but I go through some turbulence in my life. How am I going to feel? Actually, let's make it real. The year's 2018. Something really, really testing happened to me and my family. Probably was the most stressed out in my life than I've ever been in my life. How am I going to feel? Just talk me through some emotions that I'm going to have. You're going to have to shout. Anxious, yep, keep going. Very sad, yeah, very, very sad. Keep going. Overwhelmed, yep. I wasn't that far, alhamdulillah, but you're right, people do hit suicide. And this is what we're seeing a lot. We're seeing a lot, men and women, especially men, seeing that commonly, I wish I was not alive. Now there are people who experience this. And this is one of the signs of the end of time, that a man will pass by a grave and say, I wish I was in there. So we're seeing that now, where the people who are suicidal, it's about 15% of people who experience depressive type symptoms. So I'm going to have all these emotions, right? Now what happens is that you get a human being gets into that state of stress, anxiety, fear, all these emotions, right? They get into this emotional state, and they naturally look for solutions, right? Naturally look for solutions. So what should happen is that you go to people to seek support and help, like your doctor, like your therapist. If you're attached to a sheikh, like your sheikh, friends who are who help you, who don't burn you, they help you. That's what should happen, and then the cycle calibrates itself. But somewhere along the lines, people come across and stumble over alcohol, drugs, gaming, pornography, films, blah, 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 blah. The list goes on. They stumble into it, and this is the key point here. I'll give you an example. Let's just say, during that period in 2018 where I was in the probably most difficult part of my life so far, and I was really, struggling to get through life, and then I'm speaking to one of my friends and said, hey, just try one of these, bro. You'll just zone out. Try it. And then I try it. I promise you, I've never done it. And I try it. This is where it all goes wrong. So what happens is, and this is a key point, it's going to make me, if I have a spliff, it's going to make me feel what? How's it going to make me feel? Relaxed. What else? Chilled, less stressed, less anxious. Right, it's a no-brainer. A human being, what would they rather choose? Being stressed out or being chilled? Naturally. Chilled, right? A new human being would like to be chilled naturally, right? So what happens is, that state of being chilled is more pleasant. But after you have a spliff, how long does it last for? You can say it if no one's going to judge you. Huh? Yeah, it won't last long. From 30 minutes for a couple of hours, right? But 30 minutes usually, 30, 40 minutes, okay? And then a couple of hours max. And then what happens is you have that dip again in your mood and your state of mind. You become stressed, anxious, you go into your dark place again. This is where the problem happens, right? Because what happens to the brain, so this is the next slide. What happens to the brain is this. Now I want you to remember the science behind this. There's a hormone called dopamine. Dopamine is your happy hormone. It's what happens when I have a Tim Hortons, it makes me feel really happy. Okay? It gives me a bit of a, oh, that's nice. Okay? So dopamine levels go up, but this is where the problem lies. If I have a spliff right now, my dopamine levels are going to go really high, right? The second time I have it, so dopamine levels will go high, I'll feel good, then it'll go down again, I'll start to feel sad. I'll think, you know what, my brain's made a connection now that what's going to make me happy is having a spliff, right? The second time I do it, I have another spliff the second time. Does the dopamine level go as high as the first time, yes or no? It never does. It never does. The first time I had that Tim Hortons, it felt great in Toronto. Second time I had it in Toronto, it didn't feel as good. So you go from a small mug to a big mug, then a large mug, then 2 and 3. Because the first time you have that hit, that dopamine level doesn't go as high as it could or should. So you go for the second one. But the second one doesn't go as high as the first one. So what do? You take another one. So when you take 2, it becomes just as good as the first one. But then the next time you do it, after you have that dip, dopamine levels go down, you start to feel sad, anxious, stressed, etc., etc. The third time I have that spliff, does the dopamine level go as high as the second one? No. You can see where this is going, right? It's really hard to hit that high level of dopamine again. So what happens to a human being, they self-program their brains. It's not their fault, it's just the way the body's designed. They self-program their brains to convince themselves that they need to have that stronger hit to feel in that happy state again. So they start using soft drugs, like weed and so forth. Then they go to heroin, LSD and stuff like that. So the higher class A type drugs. And it just doesn't stop. Because to feel normal again, they have to have that hit. But 2 things happen. They're a lot more aggressive, and a lot more often. Now guess what? The same mechanism with alcohol and drugs happens with every single type of addictive behavior. Look, we're all adults here, we can talk about this. Take pornography. How many people do you think, percentage-wise, watch pornography right now? Let's have a guess. 50%. 1 in 2 was 56%. Let's just say 50%. 50% of adults at any given time are watching pornography. Like, it's really bad what's going on. So take pornography, for example. It starts off, they call it soft porn. There's no such thing as soft porn. Porn's porn, right? They start off with soft porn. Then, obviously, a man gets aroused, and we'll talk about masturbation in a second. A man gets aroused, the same hormones are released. Dopamine that makes you happy, okay? But then the next time they watch it, it's not as good. So they go start watching hard porn. And then the cycle continues. Like, I know of a case, this is awful. I know of a case of a very, very, educated, intelligent man who was addicted to porn, then became addicted to sex, then started having affairs left, right, and centre with all sorts. Marriage is ended now. Like he's ruined a beautiful family when you look at it from the outside. So the same mechanism happens with every single addictive type of behavior, including your phones. So if you ever wonder why, we know when you're not doing anything, you've got that free time, you pull out your phone and you're just scrolling down. Have you heard it's called doom scroll? You seen that? You know what I'm talking about, because you all do it, right? You all and you're like, what am I doing? Like, what on earth am I doing? And then you look at one thing, and then these guys, the people who run the world, the 1%, they have got you by the, should I say it? Mufti Sahib? I'll say it. They've got you by the balls, right? Look, I'm not saying this because I want to brag. It's something that I've just been conscious of. And, Mufti Muhammad and Sheikh Abdul Rahim, I'm sure, I hope I don't annoy you with this, but I don't have a smartphone, right? I've never had one. And inshallah, I hope I never get one. One of the last conversations I had with Hazrat Muhammad Yusuf was he wanted to send me some pictures on about something. I said, Hazrat, come on, man, look at my phone. He said, bohariyat. Good. He said, I don't ever get one either. So I never intend to get one. But these things, they ruin lives. The general consensus from expert psychologists across the globe is that they believe that smartphones do more damage than good. It's good to be able to, wherever you're traveling in the world, to have maps at the palm of your hand. I thought it was really impressive that I was 3,000 miles away from my grandma and I could FaceTime her. I thought that was brilliant. But on balance, these are non-Muslims, the general consensus is that smartphones have done more harm than good, okay? Because fingertip access is not necessarily a good thing all the time. Like I find it really, really weird when we get medical students and junior doctors, because I teach medical students, I teach junior doctors, and you ask them a question, the first thing they do is Google it. So when I was in medical school, and this isn't long ago, this was in 2000, if you wanted to acquire knowledge, you'd have to go to John Ryland's library. There was only 2 copies of each medical book. So you had to wait for that book, then you had to literally memorize that book because you've got 2-3 weeks and then somebody else wants it. Or you photocopy the pages, then you internalize it and memorize it, and it consolidates. So what we're seeing with our medical students and junior doctors now is that they have breadth of knowledge. They know a lot, but they don't have depths of knowledge. Does that make sense? And that same tragedy can happen with our sacred sciences. It's not necessarily a good thing that you've got everything at the palm of your hand. So that's the cycle that what happens, where dopamine takes over your life, okay? So it goes up, goes down, you go back to it again. Does that make sense? Remember that bit. Okay, next slide. What happens is that if somebody, so this is a brain scan for someone who uses cocaine. So you see the red dots, that's the part of the brain that deals with control. If you continually do something that's addictive in nature and releases dopamine, within 4 months, if you look at the brain scan, within 4 months the red dots disappear. So in 4 months' time you lose control. That's not a big window. So in 4 months' time, with certain types of behavior, you lose control, and then you become out of control. And that's why it's such a critical thing to talk about. But worryingly, this is what we see happening to human beings' brains. Any addiction, okay? Even phone addiction, right? Any addiction, people have what's called slower processing time. Have you ever talked to somebody and you're thinking, are you even listening to me? You're talking gibberish, bro. Slower processing time. So we're seeing this in medical students. You might be seeing it in your madrasas and Darul Ulooms. People can't take in information as much as well as they could or should. Because what happens is your brain's made up of 2 things: grey matter, white matter. Grey matter is your computer. The white matter, so the hardcore software. The white matter is all the connections. What happens is in any type of addiction, you have more white matter forming. In other words, your brain is dumbed down. In fact, they call it juvenile brain. So an adult can have a kid's brain because of certain addictive type of behaviors, especially watching pornography. Like they're seeing this, when they brain scan people who watch pornography, they're seeing more of this. So they have slower processing time. They can't problem solve. This part of the brain, the neocortex, it doesn't develop until you're 25 years old in a man and 18 years old in a woman, in a girl. That's why girls do better at schools and universities than men, because men don't develop this part of their brain, neocortex. Anybody know what this part of the brain is for? Problem solving. It's on the slides. Right? Problem solving. It doesn't develop as quickly as well as it should if you start early with addictive behaviors, but the worrying thing is that when you're an adult, that part of your brain shrinks. So if you can't problem solve, you're a useless man. And if you're not married, and if you are married, remember this, women hate useless men. They do. It's got nothing to do with where you look. It's got nothing to do with how much money you have. It's got nothing to do with anything apart from how useful you are to her. The worst thing for a woman is to have a needy, useless bloke. They hate it. So think about that, okay? And then you have loss of control of emotions. This is really critical if you want to make your life work, okay? Emotional regulation is everything in the game of life. It's everything. Now, men have poor emotional regulation. Any ideas why? Why do we have poor emotional regulation? Any ideas? We like to get things done. Any ideas why? There's no such thing as bad parenting, okay? Psychologists call it not favorable parenting choices. There's a difference between bad parenting and unfavorable parenting choices. We're all men here. When we were young, we fell down, we started crying. What would our dad say? Get up, man up, men don't cry. Okay, that's just the way our fathers were raised, right? What happens when you say that repeatedly to a man, they don't allow their emotions to calibrate. I feel sad, what do I do with that? I feel angry, what do I do with that? I feel nervous, what do I do with that? And when they have poor emotional regulation and they've got too much emotion in their head, what happens to a man? What do they do? How do they behave? Yeah, they just get angry. They just explode, okay? And it ruins everything. Poor memory and can't comprehend, can't hold a conversation. So as you can see, any addictive behavior, this is detrimental for a human being, for their brain. It just knackers you. Remember what I said, there's nothing worse than having a useless human. In fact, they call them useless human beings, as in they meaning the people, the 1%. They call them useless human beings, and they say openly, we will give useless human beings drugs and video games and entertainment. They call them useless human beings, just keep them distracted, and we'll carry on doing what we do, and you can finish the story. So someone has that, they slip into addictive behavior, these brain changes happen, and then they have these symptoms as well. You might notice this, okay? You could start noticing this with some of your students or people that you know. They isolate themselves, they don't want to be around people because they can't handle people, okay? They have a complete disregard for others because they can't process their emotions, okay? They have very secretive behavior, like me. I'll just be sneaking out the house, and my wife will go, where are you going? I'm just going to Asda. We don't need anything. We might need some milk. No, we don't. We might do. No, actually, I need Tim Hortons because Tim Hortons is right next to Asda. But I'm sneaking out and, semi-lying to my wife just to get out to Asda because it's next to it, right? You have that sort of behavior. Very fixated in what they do because they have a plan for everything. They plan what they want to do. So, and then, you start seeing unhealthy diet. They put on weight. Their fitness drops. Psychologically, they're all over the place, and they feel really, really sad and withdrawn. And they're the sort of signs. And one of my friends, he does a lot of youth work, and he was saying to me once, if you see a brother in the masjid and he's spending a long time making dua, go and give him a hug and say, are you okay? Are you okay? And if they say, yeah, I'm fine, what does that mean? That means you're not fine. Ask him again, look him in the eye and say, look, bro, for the sake of Allah, I love you. You're my boy. What's up? They'll open up. They're the signs that you've got to look out for because they're struggling with life and they really struggle. So that's the sort of cycle that someone gets into when they have any type of addictive behavior, whether it's alcohol, drugs, and so forth. The next bit I have to talk about, okay? Because this is a massive, massive rising problem. Okay, like I said, 60% of adults watch it in any given time. Yes, Muslims do as well, okay? And there's a direct link to instant access. Instant access. A few years ago, my daughter was a bit younger. I was doing a project. She was doing a project on Medina Munawwara. And she needed a picture of Masjid Nabwi. So I typed, don't do it. I don't want you to do this. I typed up Medina, Google Images, and it wasn't Medina Munawwara. It was a lady called Medina, and it was absolutely disgusting. This is something that a child has fingertip access to. Okay? Now, when you're a young lad going through hormones and you see a beautiful Medina, it's going to be very hard for you to turn off. Okay, you just goes from one thing to another, one thing to another. So fingertip access is never usually a good thing. Okay, because 40% of children have seen it in schools. Okay, again, Hafizab, another topic, phones. how to manage that. And really, you have to, if you're a parent, you have to lead by example. There's nothing worse than you saying to your kid, get off your phone, Abdullah. Abdullah, get off your phone. Abdullah, you're always addicted to your phone. There's just you're teaching them a masterclass of how to be a hypocrite. Why are you on it? You understand? You have to have, what I tend to do is have set times of when you go on your phone, when you reply. Okay, if you're part of an organization, you've got 101 things to do, that's different. But the vast majority of us aren't like, we're just regular guys, okay? So just have a think about that. It's another topic in itself. But what happens is with pornography is same hormones are released. When someone's watching something, your mind goes off somewhere, okay? Fantasizing. When a human being fantasizes, dopamine is released again, okay? For a man, testosterone is released as well. So dopamine goes up, testosterone goes up. We're all adults here. What happens to a man when testosterone goes up? Okay? You need to release. It happens, right? Imam Ghazali, rahimahullah, he said when a man becomes erect, 2/3 of his intellect disappears. When a man becomes erect, 2/3 of his intellect completely disappear. So then you get to a point where it's like, I need to release, right? So then what the man does, he jerks off with himself, and then you have a complete crash. Your testosterone and dopamine levels go from here to here, okay? So what we found is that people who masturbate, after they've ejaculated, they feel really, really sad and tired and sluggish because they have a complete crash. This is where the science comes in. Normally, when you're having intimacy with your wife, after after jima, the adab is to have afterplay, right? It's part of our tradition. Not to be shy about this. You have afterplay. And this is why, of course we all believe it. The Prophet ﷺ was a genius when it came to every single sphere of life, especially medicine. What's the science behind afterplay? When you have skin-to-skin contact for a man after you've had jima, so the afterplay bit, it's just skin to skin, just lying there and putting your hand on skin of your wife. What happens is 2 hormones are released, oxytocin and prolactin. So oxytocin and prolactin, as they go up through skin-to-skin contact, what happens is your testosterone levels go up as well. In other words, your testosterone levels don't stay low. So then you actually start feeling less tired, more energetic, and you're back to your baseline. What's the problem if you're on your own? That doesn't happen. That process doesn't happen. So now we've talked about the dopamine cycle. What does a human being do? They start to feel sad. They start to feel a bit sluggish. They start to feel miserable. They've programmed their brain with some sort of pleasure. What does a man go and do? He does it again. But remember, same analogy with spliff. The first time, he jerks off with himself, levels are sky high, testosterone, dopamine, and pleasure. Second time he does it, it ain't as good. And then unfortunately what happens is the cycle perpetuates and you just become more aggressive in what you watch and what you do. Does that make sense? Okay? Really, really important to have conversations with children about this. I've certainly had conversations with my son about this and the problems that it comes with it. And when you explain it to them with science, that this is what it does to you, the children, generally children, they are innocent creatures who can see truth from falsehood easily. They can see good, bad, evil very, very easily. They'll work it out for themselves of what to do and what not to do. And what we're seeing a lot in clinic, as in me, like I mentioned, a lot of my work is getting people's health right. We're seeing a lot of men like this. So we're seeing a lot of men who are very tired, very sluggish, lots of belly fat, depressive, brain fog, I can't remember anything, nothing sticks in my brain, struggling with work, low sex drive. Yes, it does affect you when you're older. If you're accustomed to masturbating when you're young, your wife ain't going to be happy. So imagine having a situation where you're a useless husband outside the bedroom and inside the bedroom as well. It ain't going to work. Like, you're really going to struggle with your marriage. Okay? So these things happen. One of the most prescribed drugs in the world for a man is Viagra. One of the most prescribed drugs in the world is Viagra. And one of the most prescribed drugs for a woman is antidepressants. So you do the maths. Okay? You can see where this is going, right? And thinning of bones. Whereas actually, if you have testosterone is the hormone that you want for a man to be up here. If you want to be in your element as a man, mentally strong, physically strong. You have to get your testosterone levels right. So this is what we're seeing physically, how it affects you. It's just a no-brainer to just stop it. But also we're seeing this a lot, and I think that ulama are probably seeing this a lot as well. Why do you think I put this up? What does this represent? Just have a guess. Link to pornography. What is this picture reflective of? What we're seeing, and this is not just a Muslim problem, so this is what patients of mine who aren't Muslim report, is that husbands, partners who are addicted to pornography, they want to carry out these disgusting acts to their wives. Like, that's just awful. I mean, let's call it what it is. That's, sexual abuse. That's molestation, right? Bordering rape. Like, there are brothers who say to their wives, if you don't carry out this sexual act with me together, I'm going to divorce you. There are brothers who, I was asked this and then I had to ask a mufti because I'm not a mufti. What do I do if my husband forces me to have sex while I'm fasting in Ramadan? Just can't let it go. That this is what we're seeing. And when I was in university, there was two sisters, this was awful, we got called because they got beat up. And they got beat up by their Muslim boyfriends because they didn't want to do a sexual act with them. And this is what we're seeing over and again, and that's just horrible. It's just an awful situation to be in. If you want more information, look at Dr. Gottman. He is an international guru with marriage. Okay, if you want to look at anybody who's dealt with marriage, look at this guy. He can put any couple in a room for 1 hour, give them a task, like do this puzzle, and he can predict the divorce rate of that couple within 1 hour, and he has a 90% hit rate of success. So look, you can read it for yourself. His words: the use of pornography by one partner leads the couple to have far less sex and ultimately reduces relationship satisfaction. We are led to unconditionally, this is an international guru, okay, unconditionally conclude that for many reasons pornography poses a serious threat to couple intimacy and relationship harmony. Like, alal itlaq, there's no debate here with this. And these are the sort of things that you want to talk about to your children and anybody who's struggling with it. Okay, where do we go from here? I'm nearly finished. Where do we go from here? So you've got a brief scratch the surface of the science behind it. Where do you go from here? This is my own reflections. If I'm wrong with people who are experienced with this, feel free to correct me, because that's what life's a journey. You're growing, you're learning all the time. You can't be 100% right all the time. I think that all but one require a careful reduction program. All types of addictive type behavior, every single one, requires a general reduction program. Because what happens is when you have so much imbalance of dopamine because of drugs or alcohol or so forth, if you suddenly just stop, you'll withdraw. And when you withdraw, you have physical effects like palpitations, you become anxious, you become sweaty, you become shaky, you can really lose your mind. So there has to be a planned program of reduction with everything. And this is where Spinney Hill comes in. They have to go on a planned reduction. But when it comes to pornography and masturbation, from my own research, every single clinical expert says that's the one where you've got to stop it straight away. There's no reduction program for this. Any ideas why? Why is specifically with this one, there's no reduction problem? You've got to stop this. You've got to nip it in the bud. Any ideas why? Anybody? Okay, I'll give you a story to try and make you. There was a brother. He said, I was in London. This is in London. I was at a bus stop, and I saw this fine-looking woman, and so I started flirting with her. And then within no time, I'm in her bedroom, and we both got our clothes off, and I'm just about to do zina with her. And then for some reason, I heard Allah in my ear. And so I said, Allah, I gotta go. I said, Allah, I've got to go. Got off. A few years later, he's at that same bus stop and he sees the same beautiful woman. But this time she's in hijab. He went, you? She went, you? And he went, yeah. And he said, what happened to you? He said, after that night, that day when we were together and you just got off and you said, Allah. I said to myself, what force is more powerful than sex? That was her words. What force is more powerful than sex? So I Googled Allah. And I found Allah. And she became Muslim. What force? So the point I'm trying to make is that with this, it's just the way our brain has been programmed, okay? That jima, intimacy, if you want one thing to save you in life, is knowing that you've got somebody who unconditionally loves you and says to you, I'm with you to the end. Like, if you want to save your life, just having a human being, it's just the way Allah's made us, the need to have a spouse. So, but if you're involved with, not you, but if a human being is involved with pornography or masturbation, what happens is, because it's so excitable for the brain, a reduction program ain't going to work just because of the nature of sex. Does that make sense? So you have to cut it out. Like, you have to, there's no other way. You have to just stop. Like people say, give me some more detail about how. No, when it comes to pornography and masturbation, you've got to stop. There's no other way. You just have to go cold turkey. And how many days do you think you need to go cold turkey for with something like this? Any ideas? It's 30, but we say 40. Why do we say 40? Go 40 days Jamaat. It'll sort you out. Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, when he was talking about Tablighi Jamaat, he said, Tablighi Jamaat, good for two people, convicts and converts. Right? So we can say 40 days, but you've got to cut it out completely. For the first 2 weeks, you'll go crazy, but then after that, you calibrate. But you have to cut it out. Now, when you deal with any addiction, including pornography and masturbation, including screen phone addiction, including gaming, including drugs, alcohol, the one thing you have to deal with is that, remember at the beginning we talked about people experience what in their life? Trauma. What I say to patients is, look, deal with your demons, deal with your traumas, or else they're going to deal with your happiness. You have to have a good hard think. What is it? What's the festering sore in your life that you think, if I sort this out, everything else in my life will be okay? And the same thing occurs. The traumas come out. So the one thing you have to support the person with is deal with your demons. Deal with them. Okay, like I was listening to Brother Arafah, right? I can't say this, but man, you're a wali. Like what you went through, and then to have the courage to talk about it, and then what you're doing now, that's just absolutely incredible, what you're doing. Now, what you went through is absolutely necessary, God's plan, for where you are now to do what you're doing. You couldn't see that at that time. But what Allah's put you in right now is just ridiculously huge in terms of what you're doing. So your sense of purpose has been achieved. But it's about getting people to see that okay, you've had traumas in your life, but those traumas were necessary because God has a plan. The one thing I say to patients, especially if they're Muslim or even if they're Christian or if they follow a faith, is Mawlana Rumi's example. He said life is like a beautiful, elegant, elaborate rug, and there's an ant and he wants to go from one end to the other. So he starts on the rug and then he goes around in a circle, then he follows the pattern, goes up, goes down, goes forwards, goes backwards. He's thinking, who designed this rug? I just want to go from one end to the other. But what does the ant, what can the ant not see? If the ant had a bird's eye view, what would he see? He'd see the beauty of the rug. And that's what life is. It's about getting people to see that your traumas were necessary to get to where you, because behind pain is greatness. Behind pain is joy. Understand? Every human being, who's, like if you talk about Anbiya, look what they went through. It's about getting people to see that, but dealing with their traumas at the same time. And then also managing the present stresses that they're with. For example, if someone says, I'm having a terrible time with my wife, this is the only way I can, get some headspace. Well, bro, you've really got to deal with your wife. You've really got to go for couple counseling. You've got to iron out your beef that you've got between each other. Like you have to, okay? It's about dealing with demons. So to manage the past and manage the present as well. And then planning for the future. And that's the three things that you want to do. Question, is it easy? Is this part easy? It's rock hard. And that's why it's really important to have these sort of institutions in there who can deal with people very, very holistically. Now, one thing I liked about Spinney Hill is that this needs to be a model for the entire ummah. And, you might think that's a bit far-fetched, but come on. When Hazrat Maulana Yusuf Sahib landed in England, rahimahullah, and he wanted to go back, he wrote to Hazrat Sheikh, I'm coming back. And he said, don't even think about coming back. It's not far-fetched that from your hands the Darul Uloom will be built and one day you'll be teaching hadith. And he said, Hazrat rahimahullah, he said he put the letter on his head and he started crying. And he said, what are you saying? And then within a few years, the Darul Uloom was built. And the rest is history. So the point is that there is a huge possibility that this can be replicated across the globe. Now, the Maulana at the beginning was talking about some statistics. So it's quite it's a massive atrocity that we're going through. But remember, when you're going through difficult times, there's a phrase that we have at work: when there's times of adversity or difficulty, it's time for audacity. What that means is that let's just smash this, because anything is possible with Allah's help. So enormous opportunity to take this forward. Now, these are just some. Oh, hold on. Yeah. So these are just some ideas they're my thoughts, and it's up for discussion between yourselves. But there needs to be a replication of this across the country, and think about, okay, is it possible to set that up, and how do we do that? Is there scope to have addictions in madrasa syllabus? Have a think. This is something that you're not going to get away from now. It's part and parcel of life. Addictive type behavior. Should it be in a madrasa syllabus of getting children to understand, okay, this is part of life? When I first bought my child, I don't have a television at home, and I was very reluctant to get my child a PlayStation. And he became he was 9, 10 at the time, he became very, very, very upset. Like, very upset, emotional. So, he's pulling out my strings. So I got him a PlayStation 4, and we had a rule: no fighting games. You're not playing on a school day, and on the weekends you're only playing 20, 30 minutes. But I went through the science behind it, and he was listening. And then the last thing I did, I held his head, and I said, Isa, I'm doing this because I love you. You need to remember that. I'm not doing that because I'm a muppet. I'm doing it because I love you. And he started crying, and he said, thank you, Dad. Now he's 16 years old, hardly plays the darn thing, hardly plays the PlayStation, because he's realized that you just look up and enjoy life. Much rather spend his time outside. So these are the sort of things that's worth teaching in madrasa as part of a syllabus. I genuinely believe that marriage needs to be taught now. Not just, obviously, the fiqh is really important, but there needs to be a newer model of how to manage marriages in 2020, in the 2020s. Because life's very different to just 10 years ago, isn't it? Life's very different to just 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and so forth. There's a way of, so again, and also parenting workshops as well. Because people need to know how to parent, and that's a lifelong art. That's a lifelong art. I've been on many courses, workshops, seminars, my own research. There's some really wonderful international gurus on parenting. It's something that needs to be taught, because if you get that wrong, kids are going to be set up for, addictive type behavior. I think this is the last slide. And these are just my thoughts, not to tell you what to do, because it's not my place to tell you what to do, because you're ulama, I'm not. But is there scope to talk about this on the minbar? Is there scope to talk about these things on the minbar? I remember, I won't mention his name, he's a very famous sheikh, and this was 20, 30 years ago. He started talking about drugs on the minbar, and the community kicked him out. You don't talk about it on the minbar. So, but should it be? Is there scope now to just be a lot more open about these sort of conversations on the minbar? Generally, it tends to be when people come to the masjid to actually listen. So it's a perfect opportunity. Workshops, specific workshops in masjids, in like initiatives like this, or outside of the masjid, to make it inclusive for people who might not feel comfortable coming to the masjid for whatever reason. Regular workshops with clear planned objectives of how to make it work. That's another option. And when you do, like, again, he's very famous, I don't want to mention his name, he's very famous mufti. He came to Manchester to give a workshop on marriage. Oh, the masjid was packed. Men and women, upstairs, downstairs. It was absolutely packed. When I do the porn addiction, when I do the addictions talk in every single masjid that I've been to, it's rammed. It's busier than talking about health and weight and mental health. So there's a massive scope for this. Youth clubs and hubs. Like, young people, they just need to know that somebody cares. They just need to know that somebody loves you. They just need to know that somebody's got your back. And youth clubs and hubs, these little safe spaces where they can go to get some headspace from the beef that they're going through, ridiculously important to help with them. And then also social media, just to increase awareness of what they're exposed to. Like, these things should be talked about, I believe. And there's a perfect opportunity to do it in the madrasa, but I appreciate how hard it is, because one mana told me, he said, Zakariyya, he said, you don't know how hard it is to work in a maktab. We were talking about this. I said, explain it to me. He said, well, the 2 hours that we get with the kids in madrasa, he said, we're undoing 22 hours of what's gone on at home and in the school. Now you try do that. And it's really hard, trying to undo 22 hours of what's going on in the home and what's going on in school. But these are just some ideas because there's a perfect opportunity to move this forward. Spinney Hill, I'll let them talk about what they've got in more detail. But I understand that they do have workshops for imams, teachers, schools, madrasas. It's on a plate. And then, one option is to get trained up yourself and then spread the love and spread it across the country. Inshallah, there's so much hope and opportunity to make it work. I'll let them do that bit. Okay. Can somebody from Spinney Hill do this bit? If that's okay. Apparently, if you scan that, what happens?
Take you to a form.
And then?
Put details into
to do some of these things. There you go. So if you scan that, maybe later, right? All this will come up for to help you. It's on a plate, so all the information's on a plate. And if you need me, contact me. I can happily come. I love Leicester. I can happily come to Leicester again. Support them financially, of course. Khusus dua as well. I went over time. I'm sorry. Any thoughts? Any questions? I'm happy to take them.